Herzlich willkommen zu Nur eine Frage. Die Frage ist, werden wir jemals Aliens finden? Ist die Rente sicher? Können Maschinen denken? Braucht Deutschland die Atombombe? Ist Armut erblich?
Nur eine Frage. Ein Podcast der ZEIT.
Herzlich willkommen zur ersten Folge von Nur eine Frage und ich muss erklären, was das alles hier soll. Erstmal, mein Name ist Jochen Wegner, ich bin Chefredakteur der ZEIT und mit diesem neuen Projekt verwirkliche ich eigentlich einen lange gehegten Wunschtraum. Und das ist der Traum, mich beschäftigen, wie viele von uns, oft wirklich ganz einfache, grundlegende Fragen, auf die es nicht immer so eine klare Antwort gibt oder sich die Experten so streiten. Und bei Alles gesagt, dem Podcast, den ich seit 7 Jahren mit meinem Kollegen Christoph Arment mache, nenne ich die manchmal Kinderfragen, die wir dort in den langen Gesprächen unseren Gästen manchmal stellen. Also Fragen wie zum Beispiel, können Maschinen denken? Oder ist Demokratie die beste Staatsform? Oder ist Armut erblich? Zerstört das Internet die Demokratie? Aber auch ganz konkrete Sachen wie, ist die Rente sicher? Ja, das sind ja einfache, direkte Fragen. Und mein Traum war es immer, diese Fragen, auf die es dann immer so eine schwer zu findende Antwort gibt, mit der besten Expertin, dem besten Experten zu besprechen, den man nur finden kann. Und ganz von vorne anzufangen und so lange nachzufragen, bis ich die Antwort verstanden habe. Am liebsten würde ich ein klares Ja oder Nein auf meine Frage bekommen. Experten mögen das nicht so, aber man kann ja mal fragen. Willkommen also zu Nur eine Frage oder wie wir in unserem kleinen Team neuerdings sagen, N1F, Hashtag N1F. N1F gibt es als Podcast, aber auch als Video, als Textinterview auf ZEIT.de und wir verschicken zu jeder Frage einen Newsletter mit Hintergrundinfos. Den Newsletter kann man abonnieren bei www.zeit.de/N1F. Und dort finden sich auch alle anderen Sachen zu Nur eine Frage, die Videos und die Podcasts und die Texte. Und nun geht's los. Wir starten mit einer meiner absoluten Lieblingsfragen, die so grundlegend ist, dass wir sie im Alltag meist nicht auf dem Schirm haben, nämlich, gibt es mich wirklich? Und was ist das eigentlich, was ich sagt? Dazu habe ich mir den wirklich besten Experten weltweit gesucht. Der heißt Anil Seth und erforscht seit bald 20 Jahren das menschliche Bewusstsein. Anil ist Neurowissenschaftler und Professor in Sussex. Er ist wirklich einer der meistzitierten Forscher der Welt überhaupt und hat ganz sicher den besten Überblick über die Bewusstseinsforschung. Ich bin gespannt, wie ihr die erste Folge findet. Wir freuen uns über Feedback an die Mailadresse n1f1 als Zahl geschrieben, n1f@zeit.de. Eine Kleinigkeit, bevor es losgeht. Das hier ist das Originalgespräch mit Anil Seth auf Englisch. Es gibt im selben Stream des Podcasts auch eine KI-Übersetzung des Gesprächs. Wer also vielleicht keine Lust hat, sich das im englischen Original anzuhören, kann auch mal ausprobieren, wie sich unsere von einer Maschine geklonten, auf Deutsch übersetzten Stimmen anhören. Das hier ist jetzt das Original. Welcome to Just One Question, where I try to explore some of the world's truly big questions with the help of the most qualified person we can find to provide an answer. And one of humanity's great questions, so close to us that we might not even think to ask it in our daily lives, is, who am I? Do I really exist? What exactly is this entity that says I? What is it that is self-aware? Do I truly exist, or is the world nothing more than an illusion? So, and Anil, you are one of the most cited scientists and a leading expert in the field of consciousness research. In your book, Being You, you describe a scene from your childhood where you look, and I remember doing the same, where you look at yourself in the mirror and reflect on the idea that yourself is somehow tied to the stuff you're made of. And what happens if the stuff is gone? Am I still there? What is it that is me? Can you tell us the story again? So how did you think in these days?
It's a memory from a long ago, and I think like all memories, it becomes less reliable the more times I try to recall it. And what comes to mind now thinking about that is an experience that I assume everybody has at some point, which is this recognition that I as an individual didn't exist at one point in time, and at some point in the future may also not exist. And for me, I locate this now in this experience of looking in the bathroom mirror in the house I grew up in. In fact, my mother still lives in this house. I still go to the same bathroom now and again, still look in the same mirror. And I look very different now. But the same thought sometimes recurs because of this context. And it is something that might be a distinctive aspect of being human. I think a lot of people wonder whether humans are the only creatures that become aware of their own mortality, of the sense that their time on the earth is circumscribed in this way. But just raising that question leads to this host of other questions that you started with, which I obviously had no idea at the time when I was 8, but have ended up defining my career for the last 20 plus years. What does it mean to be yourself? What does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to experience the world and being an individual within that world?
It's silly because we never ask this question, and it's so central to our being alive, right? So can you give us some examples where I get the feeling that I zoom in and out of my conscious self? So I think you mentioned in your TED Talk, anesthesia, like if you have surgery and you just got cut off of your consciousness and then it's switched on again and no time has passed. A nurse at some point in time, she told me, think of something nice. Now we start, think of something nice, and when you wake up, we will think the same thing. And it was true. I thought about walking through Paris or something, and I woke up, no time had passed, and I was still in Paris. So have you other examples of where ordinary people like me can kind of feel the kind of very strange detachment you sometimes feel?
It does happen. I think the circumstances are often not that common, which is why it's very easy to take this experience of being a self for granted. And part of the challenge, and part of I think the delight of investigating these questions is this continual process of digging into what we normally just assume has to be the case, assume just is. We open our eyes, whether it's when coming around from anesthesia or just waking up on a normal morning, and there's a world. And it seems to have all these properties and colors and shapes and people. It's almost as if there's nothing to explain there, as if the world just pours itself directly into our minds. And it's the same with this feeling of being a self, even more so in a sense, because the feeling of being you or being me is more stable, more continuous, most of the time, for most of us, than our experiences of the world. And so it's even easier just to take it for granted that myself is just there, perhaps perched behind my eyes somewhere, perhaps nowhere. And there are not that many occasions where that gets disrupted. There are a few. So in anesthesia, everything goes away. Experiences of any kind of self and world, these experiences are just abolished and then they recover. But there are other situations, I think, where experiences of self can change to the extent that we notice the change. So one example, hopefully not an everyday example for many people, are different kinds of psychiatric disorders where we can experience the self as being changed. Maybe thoughts appear that don't feel like our own thoughts in schizophrenia, or dissociative disorders where experiences of the self stop feeling real in some way. I think we can get close to that in some contexts. One example that comes to mind now is jet lag. If you have jet lag, like across a lot of time zones and you wake up in a foreign country, to me anyway, things feel a bit different. Exactly. I feel a bit dissociated from myself. Another example is flow. There's the Georgian psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, a wonderful name, talked about this flow state. And, you may get it in when you're playing sport or even solving problems. You enter this state.
And you forget time.
You forget time. You don't experience yourself reflecting. You're very much in the moment. And I think in those conditions, some aspects of what it is to be a self are attenuated. Maybe not all, but certainly the monitoring, rational stream of thought that we often confuse with what the self is, but is certainly part of the self. That can go away in these situations.
1 million questions. First question. Is there a connection of self-awareness with the feeling of having a soul? So, hundreds of years ago, people thought about themselves, and I assume they thought, hey, this person in the mirror, if it's gone, I will be still there because I have this soul. So maybe the whole construct came out of self-awareness and consciousness. Could that be?
That's a really interesting question. Thinking about it now, I think the reason that many cultures invented the concept of a soul might have something to do with the fact that we not only have conscious selves, or we have experiences of being an individual, but we have this higher level, as you called it, self-awareness. Mm-hmm. Now, self-awareness to me is not simply the experience of being a self, it's the awareness that we have those experiences. Like, I know I experience myself as who I am. I can reflect on it. I have a name. I can talk about myself as an individual. And the ability to reflect on these experiences of selfhood, I think, then can encourage us to try and relate that to some essence, something that really exists. And the soul is a concept which I think tries to make sense of that. But it does so in different ways. And this for me is very interesting. Often the idea of a soul is thought of as somewhat antithetical to modern science, where we should have no need for these kinds of semi-mystical or spiritual or religious concepts. But I'm not so sure about that at all, because I think there is a sense of being an individual that is very deep and which is in need of some explanation, and which experience of soul might be a useful description.
The feeling that I'm more than my body. There's something else. Well, people like you tell me that I'm just a machine, the cells,
not just a machine.
Neurons, a great machine. But there's nothing else, Jochen.
Well, it depends what you mean by nothing else, right? I mean, there's a tendency to think of scientific explanations like this as disappointingly reductive. There's nothing but atoms in the void. You're nothing but a soup of chemicals. Your thoughts are nothing but the firing of billions of neurons. And this use of nothing but is completely meaningless in my sense.
Why?
Because it sort of suggests that you're just when you say, it's a very diminishing kind of explanation, where you could equally say your thoughts are the wonderful combination of all the firings of all your neurons, your brain activity. There's no need to think that it is reductive in that sense of it being draining the wonder and the mystery. You
are the most interesting thing that happened to matter. That's a nice compliment, right?
That's a much better way to put it. Exactly.
Okay, there's another question. Is there a connection between, just asking, because you mentioned chronobiology and also the feeling of time passing, is there a connection between, our impression of time and consciousness?
There is, and I think it's still one of the deepest mysteries. And this is partly because time is a mystery however you think about it. If you think about it as a philosopher, people don't really know how to understand it. As a physicist, even more complicated.
I'm a physicist. Don't mention time in physics. It's a real problem.
It's a real problem. And it's the common sense, intuitive view of time as something that linearly flows from the past to the future is challenged both by physics, since general relativity, but also when we think about our experience of time, yes, we experience it as flowing, but we also experience duration, we experience things happening in particular orders. And just as our experience of other things in the world is not a direct reflection of their objective existence, things like color, partially constructed by the brain, the same, I think, is true of our experiences of time. They're not direct reflections of whatever physical time is, and even that we don't really know, but it's a construction based on something else. And my colleague at Sussex, Warwick Rosebeam, has done an awful lot of, I think, brilliant work trying to understand our experience of time in terms of how we experience the world through our other modalities, our vision, our hearing. So the brain, in a sense, infers the passage of time from other senses. It's not just that we have this clock in the head.
Okay, so if we zoom in now, I'm a machine built of atoms and cells that organize themselves. We call it life, which is also a mystery, to me at least. How does consciousness work from your perspective as a scientist, from this mechanical standpoint? How does it work?
Well, that's the $1 million question, or the $1 billion question these
you
days.
have to answer it.
I don't know how consciousness works. I think anyone who claims that they do is being overconfident about the answer now.
Okay.
I think there are some useful and productive ways to think about it which start to dissolve the mystery. But it's really still the early stages of this journey. But in the way you frame the question, I think you highlight a way of thinking about consciousness that I find very appealing and that is not shared by all that many of my colleagues, which is its connection to life.
Right.
I do think there is something deep and continuous about the relationship between life, mind, and consciousness. That consciousness is in some sense a property of living systems.
But what is life? Oh, another big question we may have in this podcast another time, but let's just open the brackets. What's life?
Life, Erwin Schrödinger wrote a lovely book about this, what is life in the 1940s. And it's hard to pick on one feature of what distinguishes living things from other things, but I think one property that I think is very important is the fact that living systems recreate their own material basis, their own material existence. There's continual turnover of cells. Cells reproduce their own structure. The term for this, introduced by some Chilean biologists, is autopoiesis. It really literally means systems and networks of processes that regenerate their own material basis. If you think about it, this is a very sharp distinction between living systems and the technological artifacts that we build, like computers or cars or tables. A computer can do lots of things, but it doesn't produce its own silicon basis. It transforms inputs into outputs. Living systems transform inputs into outputs too, but they also continually regenerate themselves. They resist what in physics, the second law of thermodynamics, one of the, again, I think most often discussed aspects of physics.
We have to explain it for...
So this idea that there's a tendency for things to move towards states of disorder.
The world is getting more chaotic and warmer. Because being cold is a state of higher order.
Right. So there's this general principle that states of disorganization should be more common than states of organization. So if you have something in an organized state, then all else being equal, it will tend to move to a state of disorder, disorganization. The universe is gradually becoming more homogeneous. But locally, systems can resist this tendency to become more disordered.
They're called parents.
They may be, but any kind of living system does this, because a living system is not a closed system. It can take in energy, it can consume energy, and therefore it can retain its organization away from this state of equilibrium. So that's another way to think of what living systems are. They maintain themselves in this state of statistical improbability, resisting the tendency to fall apart, at least up until a certain age.
Well, there's another secret. So we have time, I hope. So there's another secret behind life, because you're wondering if there's not God deciding to create life, then there has to be a kind of random process generating over the billions of years of the existence of Earth or the universe or whatever, to accidentally create something that can live, that can replicate itself or survive, so shut out entropy. Is that the beginning of self? So if you have the first, cell or the basic chemicals cells are made of, is that the beginning of life and also of some kind of early consciousness then?
It may be the beginning of some of these things, for sure. I think it's definitely the beginning of life as we know it on Earth. I think that's been one of the more beautiful stories in the history of science, that we understand how life can arise through evolution. Well, strictly, we don't really know that yet. I mean, evolution's a very good theory of how living systems can get more complex and more adapted to different environments. The origin of life itself, I think, is still shrouded in a little bit of mystery. But something along these lines makes sense to me, that when you have processes of selection that might operate on even very simple things that don't have DNA or anything like this, but you have a process of selection that you can end up with things that tend to stick around for longer than other things. That's the basis on which evolution can get going. And other things like genetic replication and so on can come later. That may be, and I think to me it's quite compelling, that is necessary but not sufficient for what we call a self. That might be the deep historical origin of what you and I call ourselves when we look in the mirror. That ultimately it's rooted in this distinction of some part of the universe from another part of the universe that's actively maintained. It's not passively maintained. A table is distinct from the rest of the world, but it doesn't actively maintain its identity as a table. It will just become dust over time. But we actively maintain ourselves in this state of unexpected organization. Yes, I think that is the origin of self, as something that's actively maintaining its structure against dissolution. I don't think it's necessarily the origin of, or that once you have that, you don't automatically also have consciousness.
Sure. But somewhere there is the hidden secret, maybe. Because if life is connected to consciousness, as you mentioned before, it's one of your theories that there's this strong connection, and a computer that doesn't replicate itself maybe can't be conscious at the end. So I was wondering why it made sense for, if we think like Darwin, why did it make sense for nature to have at one point in time, I'm sure it's forbidden to talk like this, but I'm not a biologist.
No, nothing is forbidden.
Why did it make sense? There's no purpose, but it seems useful to have consciousness for higher organisms or whatever. Why? Why at all?
It's a difficult question. People often raise the possibility that all the things that we do, we could imagine being done by a system that doesn't experience anything.
Yes,
a complicated robot of some kind. Yeah. That's just executing some function.
No feelings.
Nothing it is but like to be that system.
You have to see something and you have to touch things, right? Something like that. There has to be an interaction with the world. A robot without I think senses doesn't make sense.
I don't think without any interaction with the world, I don't think consciousness would have evolved. But in the world in which we live now, I think it's entirely possible to have systems which are conscious, which do not interact with the world or the body.
What does that mean? So if we have software?
I don't think it's a matter of software, but for instance, people who have severe paralysis or brain injury can be conscious and not interact with the world at all. Of course, they have a history of interacting with the world. So that's one sort of example. But then I think there are some more interesting examples. There's a lot of work now in synthetic biology developing things called cerebral organoids. And these are clusters of cells which are actually human brain cells derived from human embryonic stem cells. If you treat them in the right way, they differentiate into neurons and they wire up. And these organoids are becoming increasingly complex. The reason people make these systems is to use them as models for various kinds of neurodegenerative or neurodevelopmental disorders. So they're good reasons. But I think here we have a situation where we have synthetic systems which have no history of interaction with a world at all. But they're made of the same stuff that brains are made out of. So while I am not convinced they are conscious, I don't think there's good reason yet to think there is something it is like to be this collection of brain cells in a dish. I also think that as these things get more complex, maybe that's on the table.
Okay. But it's still cells, biology, not hardware and silicon stuff, right?
That's right. But I want to return to the question you asked actually about the function, because I think this is always the right question to ask. I mean, it's a cliche, almost a cliche in biology, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's a lovely quote from Theodore Dobzhansky. And so we can ask the question, what does consciousness do for us? Even if we don't need it in general, what does it do for us? And thinking of things this way, conscious experiences are incredibly valuable for organisms that have them. And the way I think about this is that every conscious experience that we have brings together an enormous amount of relevant information for the survival prospects of that organism in a single format that also includes the body in a way that immediately represents in this format opportunities for action. And also the future prospects for that organism. Now, we experience in a single moment, in a unified scene, the world and the self with emotion and valence. Things are good, things are bad. We experience our bodies, a sense of agency. And this is a fantastic engineering solution to a very difficult problem. As we, as organisms, we're bombarded by all different kinds of information from different senses. We can do many different things over different time scales. So it's an extraordinarily challenging problem for my brain to decide simply which muscle to move next. How does that contribute to the overall goals of the organism? And conscious experiences, I think, as they are in us, fulfill that role. And many experiments suggest that there are certain things that we can do without consciousness being involved. We can perceive things unconsciously, we can make reflex actions, but when we need to integrate information from many different sources and behave in ways which have a longer time horizon, it seems very difficult to do this in the absence of consciousness.
Yeah. Is social interaction also connected to consciousness?
I think it shapes our conscious experience in us, but I don't think it's necessary. Some people say that it is. Some people think that consciousness is constitutively a social phenomenon.
Could be.
It could be, but I think that falls into the trap of looking at things a bit too much through the human lens. So, for us, social interactions are very important.
Yeah.
If we think of consciousness more as a self that expresses itself through language, then we might think of social interactions as playing a more necessary role. But if we think of consciousness as something that's much more generally prevalent within biology, that has to do more fundamentally with responding to the environment in ways that are conditioned on how the body is doing, how good a job the brain is doing keeping the body alive, then there's nothing that's necessarily social about that.
Mm-hmm. So let me come back to something you said. So consciousness is good because, well, I have a representation of myself, and I can make better predictions about complex futures if I'm aware of this. I'm here, and should I invest in ETFs? Should I buy a house? Should I whatever? This is why I asked about a social connection of consciousness.
But there's
the most complex problems are in human environments or many entities trying to navigate the world, right? And you have to think about. So I have to have also an impression of your thinking and stuff like that. So it's the most complex stuff I can imagine.
Well, it is very complex. I mean, the problem of other minds is a big problem for organisms to solve, to thrive, to survive in an environment.
Will I be eaten?
Well, I have to know
by Anil or not?
Right. Part of what it is to be me is defined by how my brain perceives what other people perceive me to be like. Mm-hmm. Part of myself is literally in the minds of others in that sense.
Are there parts in the brain trying to predict what you're thinking and stuff like that? There's a whole...
Well, there's a whole and fairly, I think, what's the right word? There's a whole and somewhat unedifying story about mirror neurons,
right?
that can come up here, which are these neurons in the brain that you see them fire.
If you get hurt, I feel you.
Well, yeah, but I would hope so. I mean, I don't want to put that to the test, But the idea that this process is reducible to a sort of single type of neuron or a single brain region is, I think, a great oversimplification. Mm-hmm. And so this sort of story of mirror neurons, which have these semi-magical properties of compassion or empathy or modeling another, no, I mean, they're part of that process. But exactly how the brain does this, I think this story will be not something that's associated with this brain region or that neuron. Mm-hmm. I do think there's a common principle at work here, which is that the brain is always making predictions.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes these predictions are about things in the world, like how is light bouncing off this table in between us? And predictions about things like that, in my view, underpin visual perceptions and then visual conscious experiences. Other predictions will be about the body. They underpin experiences that have to do with the self, at least with that aspect of the self that is experienced as my body. And then others will have to do with other minds.
Let's come back to the machine thing. So how is consciousness produced? So is it allowed to ask, is there a region where consciousness is created in the brain?
I mean, you can ask it.
I could ask.
So it's allowed.
What's the answer?
The answer is I don't think it's the right question.
Sorry.
And but it's not entirely the wrong question because one of the things that neuroscientists have been doing since they've been allowed to study consciousness, because of course that was not really allowed for quite some time, was to sort of put aside some of these more difficult metaphysical, philosophical issues and just recognize that, okay, we all have brains. Brains empirically seem to be very intimately associated with consciousness. So let's just look for correlations. Let's look for the footprints of consciousness in the brain. And at least that's something we can do. We can put someone in a brain scanner and look at what happens when they lose consciousness, or when they experience one thing or not another thing. We can look for the neural correlates of consciousness. This was really all the rage when I started working in this area in about 2000. And you find out lots of interesting things. I mean, one observation which I still find remarkable is that the human brain, your brain, my brain, has about 86 billion neurons. It's a very large number. 3/4 of these neurons are in parts of the brain called the cerebellum, which is this kind of mini brain hanging off the back of the cortex. It's smaller than the rest of your brain, but it's densely packed with neurons, so it contains many more neurons. It's heavily involved in motor control, in controlling our movements and ordering our thoughts, but it doesn't seem to be much involved in consciousness. And that to me is just striking. Like, 3/4 of our brain cells aren't involved in consciousness at all. Or not so much.
Correlated.
Not correlated. They may be involved somehow, but there are people who are born without a cerebellum. They have problems coordinating their movements, but they're very clearly conscious.
Yeah.
And that's one thing we can say, that, okay, consciousness is not everywhere. It's not a property of just neurons in general. And then when it comes to the rest of the brain, the lesson seems to be, it depends how you look. So some experiments will suggest that the correlates of consciousness are found more towards the back of the brain. But other experiments and other theories will say the opposite, that actually the correlates of consciousness are more in the front of the brain. And this is a very current debate, and I think it's interesting. But one issue here is that correlations by themselves, well, they're neither causation nor do they constitute explanation. So they can put some useful constraints on how we might develop theories of consciousness. But just searching for the correlates alone and saying, consciousness is here, here, or here, that's not going to get you all that far.
You're doing a lot of interesting experiments to map the boundaries of consciousness, right? Can you give us some example? That's the wrong expression. You're trying to find out how it works. And so can you tell us about these experiments?
I mean, we try to do a diverse range of experiments in my group and in collaborations with others. So some of the stuff we do is simply looking at data recorded, usually in the labs of collaborators, of global changes in consciousness. Because this is, I think, one of the more, it's one of the simplest experimental avenues. We talked about anesthesia earlier.
Yes.
So we can look at what happens in the brain when people go into and come out of anesthesia.
Right. What happened?
Many things happen. And the short story there is that it's not really a single region, but what we see is that different parts of the brain talk to each other less.
Okay.
There's less what we call functional connectivity. There's less interaction in specific ways, which we try to get a bit more detailed about. And this is where I think some of the action is, but it's also where things get really very mathematical and technical. So we're trying to come up with mathematical measures that distinguish between these different global states of consciousness, right, that also have some explanatory power. So they can sort of say that you can say something like, I would expect this measure to be higher when people are conscious rather than not, because it captures something about the nature of every conscious experience. I'll give you one example of this, which is something we're working on now, which is something called emergence. Now, this is another philosophically loaded term. What is an emergent property? We all know in some ways what is being referred to here. If you look at a flock of birds, in Brighton where I live, these starlings tend to flock in the evening in winter before settling on to roost on the pier. And the flock seems to have a life of its own in some way.
Yeah, beautiful.
Even though it's nothing but the birds within it. Again, there's nothing but
machines with some neurons doing strange stuff.
But does the flock really exist? Is there something about the flock, or is it just in the eye of the observer? So that's
it's just mathematics.
Well, it is and it isn't. So this is an emergent property, right? The flock does in fact constrain what the birds do. There's the flock is, you can predict what an individual bird will do by knowing what the flock looks like better than you can do otherwise. But the flock has this kind of unified property that is more than any individual bird. And people have said some similar things about conscious experiences. That you can think maybe that a conscious experience is sort of like a bunch of neurons flocking together, but not in physical space, but in some kind of mathematical space.
Right.
So there's something about their activity that becomes a unified whole. And if we can find a way to measure that, then we have something that becomes testable on brain data, but also something that has some explanatory power. It's a sort of thing that explains one aspect of what consciousness is like, which is that it is unified.
So so if I got it right until now, what you tell me is, I'm a machine, and my brain does beautiful things with kind of self-organizing neurons, and suddenly consciousness emerges out of that patterns in my brain. And it makes a lot of sense to do that because I can predict complex futures.
So, let's go through those
I didn't
points.
pass the test at your university, I assume.
So, machine, to start with, I think is one of these...
Oh, I shouldn't say machines.
Well, no,
again.
I actually quite like it because but I like it only from a particular point of view that it's saying there's nothing spooky or supernatural, right? We are physical organisms made of stuff that does stuff. But there's a big difference, as we already touched on, between the machines that we make, that we typically think of as a machine, like a lawnmower or a robot, and a living system which reproduces itself.
Forget the machine. I never mention it again.
So that's a very important difference. Then this idea of emergence. Yeah, I think that's right, but I think it has to be understood in a particular way. Emergence is sometimes used as a substitute for explanation, like a form of magic. You say something emerges from something, it's almost like abracadabra, and then you get this thing.
Yes.
I want to use it in a very non-mysterious sense, to actually pin down what it means for something to emerge, understand how that happens, and what it can do in virtue of being emergent. But I think that's right. I think consciousness is a property of many neurons, not of a single neuron. So in some sense, that's right. And then the last thing, prediction, yes, but not necessarily complex predictions about what fun to buy or something like that. I think the role of prediction runs very, very, very deep. If you think again about what the fundamental role of a brain, any brain in any animal is, it's to keep the body alive. It's to regulate the physiology of that body, to keep it within the relatively small ranges that are compatible with staying alive. Our blood oxygen levels can't change that much. There are many things. Our temperature cannot change that much. And any control engineer will tell you that a good way to regulate a system, to keep some of its parameters within tight ranges, is to have a predictive model of that system, so that the system can anticipate when it might deviate and make sure it doesn't deviate. So in my view, the reason brains can be thought of as these engines, biological engines of prediction that then underpin all our conscious experiences, is because prediction turns out to be such a useful way of regulating the body. And from that establishes a core principle which turns out to really fit very nicely with what we understand about the anatomy of brains and how they work. When we look at how areas connect to each other, they fit nicely with this scheme. And it's a common principle that then can underlie many different aspects of cognition, thinking, consciousness, brain operation. And that in itself is appealing because evolution also works like that. If evolution hits upon something that can be repurposed in many different ways, it will do it. And it's easier to make variations and select among those variations in ways that can serve a common principle of operation.
Yeah. Just to be sure, in your world, is consciousness a 1 or 0 thing? So it's on or off, it's there or not, or is it a continuum? And what does that even mean? So when does it start? With 20 cells, 2 billion cells?
I mean, you keep asking these unanswerable questions, which I guess is why we're here.
What this podcast is all about, yeah.
And but they're all unanswerable, I think, in interesting and in different ways. So I actually think consciousness, in a sense, is both, which sounds rather implausible, but think of a pile of grains of sand
Mm-hmm.
And it's an old example in philosophy, I think, as well. You have one grain of sand, you add another. At what point does it become a pile? There's no single grain of sand that makes the difference.
Right. So it's a continuum of...
But there is still, if you look at one grain or two versus a pile, in one case there clearly isn't a pile, in one case there clearly is. So 4 is a pile. That's the problem. You can't pick a number, right? Is it 10,000? It's not even, and we already know it's not a matter of the number of neurons, because 3/4 of your neurons don't care about consciousness.
Learned that already.
So I think consciousness can be graded, and we can have more or less of it, both within an individual when falling asleep or something, and maybe across species as well. So there's, I think, a sense in which a human being may be more conscious than, let's say, a fruit fly or a fish. I mean, we have to always be careful here of not just blindly being human exceptionalist. But still, I think there's a reasonable way we can think there. But where does consciousness grey out? Is there a bright line, a single threshold? I think that's hard for me to defend the idea that there's a single threshold.
Yeah. So you try to establish a theory about consciousness. What are the other theories? What are the most interesting theories you do not like?
Well, I first want to say that my ideas about consciousness are not strictly my own anyway. They're built upon a whole history of thinking about the brain as a prediction machine.
That's a special direction.
It's a special direction, but actually since we're in Germany, one of the great motivators of this way of thinking was Hermann von Helmholtz, a great German polymath, physicist, physiologist. Physicist, also physiologist though. And he was the first person to suggest that perception was this process of the brain making inferences about the causes of sensory signals, and rather than just objectively reading out the world as it is. So the way I think about things inherits very directly from Helmholtz, and indeed from Kant before him. The direction I've taken it is distinctive mainly in terms of connecting these things to explaining the phenomenology, which is to say the kind of what it feels like of conscious experiences, why emotion feels different from vision, feels different from the sense of wanting to do something, agency, and in its deep connection to life. I try to draw this through line from the brain as a prediction machine to the fact that we are living organisms. And there I use the term machine as well. So I still use it. But yeah, there are many other theories out there too, and that are much more popular than mine, and they tend to think of consciousness in slightly different ways and therefore propose slightly different explanations.
Just a bullet point list.
Bullet point list. You have global workspace theory.
What's that?
This is the idea. I think the simplest way to think about it is a kind of theater metaphor. So you have all these sensory inputs. They're all competing for access to the stage on the theater. And when they get onto the stage, maybe they shout the loudest from the sidelines. They get onto the stage and suddenly everybody else, which in this metaphor is every other part of the brain, can see what's on the stage. And that's the theater of consciousness.
Okay.
So when information in this theory enters this global workspace, which is not a literal theater, but it's a network of interconnected brain regions.
It's pulled into the light of the brain.
It's pulled into the light of this highly interconnected functional workspace where if I'm conscious of something, then I can do many things with that. If I see this cup of coffee consciously, I can decide to ignore it, to drink it, to throw it in your face, to tip it over the side of the table. There's many things I can do because that conscious experience has access to many other parts of my brain. I can talk about it, I can memorize it, and so on. So that's one theory. One second bullet point on that, though, tends to be a theory of what I like to think about, or what a philosopher has called access consciousness, like what you can do when you are conscious of something. It's not really telling me very much about the experience of the coffee cup itself, what it's like to see a coffee cup. So that's one theory. Another very prominent theory is, very bullet point now, higher order thought theory. This has a tradition more in philosophy than in neuroscience. And it's the idea that consciousness requires a sort of higher level monitoring of other parts of the brain. So my brain, in this case, I'm looking at the coffee cup. My visual cortex might form patterns of activity that depend on the coffee cup being there. But that itself is not enough. There needs to be another part of my brain which is sort of looking at what's happening in my visual cortex and saying, aha, this is a coffee cup and I'm now conscious of it. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't tend to find this particular line of thinking that appealing, but I think it's sort of rules out. It puts quite a high bar on what's necessary for consciousness. So that's another theory.
Okay.
And then the last one, I think, is what is probably the most controversial theory in the space of prominent theories of consciousness, which is called integrated information theory. And this is I find it very fascinating and also slightly confounding theory. It challenges some of our basic conceptions about consciousness being produced by some biological matter or some physical process. It suggests that consciousness is inherent in the capacity of a physical system to have certain causes and effects. So a system doesn't have to do anything in order to be conscious. It has to have the potential to do things, but it doesn't actually have to do anything. So this is a very highly precise, highly mathematical theory of consciousness, and it starts from phenomenology. Like most theories of consciousness start in a way from looking at the brain and seeing how it works and trying to use that to think how we might account for consciousness that way. This theory goes the other direction. It says conscious experiences have axiomatic properties. There are things that have to be true for every conscious experience. They have to be integrated. There's one, they have to be exclusive. You have one and not another. And then it tries to derive what kinds of physical systems are necessary to satisfy those properties. This has the consequence or the implication that many things are conscious. That consciousness is, it's present in a simple thermostat or in any mechanism that has a certain sort of cause-effect richness. It's a very challenging theory. It's very difficult to test, and that's causing a little bit of a problem.
How could we test? Can you prove that I'm really conscious?
Can't prove it, but it's the inference to the best explanation, which is good enough in most fields of inquiry.
What if I build, a machine that simulates me, maybe just a chat interface, but whatever. But it's not based on life, it's just software, which simulates every aspect of being a conscious entity. How could you decide if I'm conscious or not? I'm asking because it's a big debate in AI now. Did we build already self-conscious things? And what does that mean? How do you see this discussion?
It is a big debate, and I think it's becoming increasingly timely because the capabilities of the AI systems we have are encouraging us to think in this way. They're encouraging us to ascribe things like consciousness to these systems because they're pulling on our psychological intuitions and biases in very, very powerful ways. In principle, you can simulate anything. I mean, that's one of the great powers of computation. Even the very well-defined but quite limited form of computation that Alan Turing defined with his Turing machines back in the 1950s. A Turing machine, which is the basis of all the computers we have, you can simulate anything.
In theory.
In theory, and with varying levels of precision and so on. But, you can simulate things. But there's a big difference between simulation and instantiation. For some things, if you simulate, then effectively you're also doing that thing. If you simulate chess playing on a computer, the computer is actually playing chess. There's nothing else to it, really. But on the other hand, if you have a simulation of a rainstorm, or a weather system, then however detailed, fine-grained your simulation is, it's not the weather. It doesn't actually get wet or windy. So one of the ongoing debates is what if we simulated the brain? And this is a little bit outside of AI. We'll come back to AI, but if we simulated the brain in as much detail as we could, would that be enough to give rise to consciousness?
Yeah.
So it would be more like chess, or would we just have a really useful, detailed simulation of a brain, but it would be a simulation more like a weather forecast. So we could predict what the brain would do or what consciousness would be like, but it itself would be no more conscious than a computer weather model is wet and windy. Now, I tend to think along those lines, that I think computation is a very powerful method for simulation, modeling, and some of the things that brains do may be computational, but that consciousness may not be one of those things, and that at best we can simulate but not instantiate consciousness.
So there's no danger at all, which is a relief, that we accidentally create living, self-conscious beings that are really sad to be on this planet.
Well, I would not be so sanguine, because nobody knows. I might very well be wrong about this. One of the other differences between the views that I've been developing and these other theories is that at least some of the other theories really do propose that computation is enough. And I don't think they're right, but I also wouldn't want to be overconfident about my own perspective on this. So there is still, I think, a danger there. And even if I am right, and that consciousness is not a matter of computation, our technologies are still moving in a direction where we're building systems which are increasingly brain-like. We have neuromorphic forms of computation now, neuromorphic engineering, which is just to say neural networks which are less abstract than the neural networks that power our current generation of AI, that hew more closely to what brains are actually like. And then we already mentioned these organoids made of real human brain cells. So as we build systems that are increasingly brain-like, I think we are moving the needle on what it might take to develop real artificial consciousness. But how far we have to go, I would claim we'd have to build living AI before we have conscious AI, and we're not on that trajectory. But the other danger here is that in a sense it doesn't matter. And it's a distraction that it's a distraction that can sometimes obscure us from an issue which I think is of real practical importance now. And it's very easy to continue arguing and debating for hours and hours about whether AI could actually be conscious or not. And these questions are important and very interesting and very deep. But on the other hand, we already have AI systems which give us the very powerful impression of being conscious. And this is because we have certain kinds of psychological intuitions or biases that we can't get out from underneath. And we're very anthropocentric creatures. Which means we tend to see the world through a human lens. And we tend to associate things like intelligence, consciousness, and language together. So when AI systems like language models start to speak to us in amazingly fluent ways, it's very easy to start projecting into them the other properties that go along with that kind of language in humans: understanding, feeling, consciousness, mind. Even though these systems might not have any of these things, they're doing something maybe very, very different. And when we have generative AI and deepfakes of video and voice and all of these things too, these also play into our tendency to project consciousness into things on the basis of what may be superficial similarities. So this raises, I think, a whole set of different dangers, which is what happens when we live in a world that we share with artificial entities, which we may believe are not actually conscious, but we can't help feeling that they are. And I think this is a world where there's much less uncertainty. There's no technological roadblock. There's no deep metaphysical question. For some people, some of the time, we already live in that world.
Right. So you have the feeling that your computer is a real person and you can insult it.
Or you play nice to it.
So I'm always friendly to ChatGPT. I try to be polite. I thought about this quite some time now. Why do I do this? I don't know, because it's just a machine. There's no conscious self on the other end of the connection, right?
So I'm very glad that you believe that, but I think implicit in what you say there is that even though you believe that, there's some part of you which would still feel bad if you treated ChatGPT badly.
And you know why? I think it's because it says more about me than about the machine. It reflects my connection to the world rather than my kind of thinking about the computer.
I think that's right. And there's a lot of precedent for this. There are good reasons why it's generally psychologically unhealthy for us to treat things that seem to have feelings as if they don't.
Yeah.
I think, and Kant again described this as a brutalizing effect on our minds.
And what you say is that there's a danger, because if I have the feeling that everything's alive, and I really have the strong impression.
Hold on, let's not confuse alive with conscious.
I'm sorry, it's conscious.
Yeah,
it's also a living kind of entity. There's another entity that has maybe also feelings, but there's something. There's a person, whatever the metaphor may be. There's a danger for me, not for the thing.
That's right. That's the difference between these two scenarios. If the system actually is conscious, then there are many dangers for that system.
Right.
It has moral considerability. It has its own interest. If it has the potential for suffering, then we would have created a vast ethical conundrum, catastrophe.
But we don't think so, because we read all your works.
Hopefully we don't think so, but we might. But if we create systems that we believe are not conscious, but we nonetheless feel are, then you're right. The problem is now not for
psychology.
The thing. The problem is for our own minds. And there are no ideal options here, because to simplify, we have two choices. Either we treat these systems as if they are conscious, so we're very polite to ChatGPT. We really just play along with this illusion of consciousness. Why is that problematic? Well, another fact about human psychology or observation is we have this sort of in-group, out-group tendency. If one thing is in, another thing is out. And if we expend our sort of moral capital, our moral resources on things that are nothing more in reality than hunks of silicon and code without feelings, then we will probably care less about other things that actually do deserve our moral consideration. We reinforce again this human exceptionalism, where things that are more human-like we care about, and things that are not, we don't. And that's been a current of I think human history, which has led to a lot of suffering in the long view. So that's a danger in one way. But then the danger in the other way is this brutalizing effect, that if we learn to not care about systems, even though they seem conscious, it's very, very psychologically unhealthy for our own minds. The science fiction series and film Westworld, I think, beautifully examines how traumatic that can be, both for individuals and for society. So the idea, I think, often the implicit idea that there's some overarching goal, some holy grail of AI, that it should be maximally human-like.
Yeah.
People often talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, in these terms. I think we need to re-examine that assumption. That may not be, I don't think it is, the kind of AI that we should want. We should be thinking of AI systems that complement our own cognitive capabilities, that don't try to mimic them quite so much.
Actually, because you mentioned already Westworld, there are quite a few science fiction movies or books that reflect on these problems we are discussing now. So, for example, there's Ex Machina, with the Garland test, where you have a robot, whatever, a thinking system, which has to convince a human that it really has feelings. That's the test, right? If I got it right. So if the human gets trapped into this world where he thinks, or in this case, he thinks that she, the machine, is alive, then it's conscious. Then I have won. Which doesn't say anything about real consciousness, as I learned, right? Can you just, before we ask the fundamental question, can you recommend 2 or 3 great books, fiction?
Books, yes. So, I mean, Ex Machina is a great film. I think it's a beautiful examination of some of these issues. And it also has a distinction, I think, of being, I think, maybe one of the only cases where it's inspired a new philosophical term. So everyone, well, not everyone, lots of people are familiar with the idea of the Turing test,
right,
conceived by Alan Turing. Along the same lines you just described, the Turing test is passed when a human cannot tell the difference between a person pretending to be another person and a computer pretending to be another person, but in this disembodied way. And the Turing test was articulated as a test of intelligence, machine intelligence, not of consciousness. And Turing was well aware of this distinction, even in 1950. And there's a piece of dialogue in Alex Garland's film Ex Machina where one character asks the other, do you know what the Turing test is? And that's described. And this is, no, the real test is to show you that she's a machine and see if you feel that she has consciousness. So it's changing the game in a very interesting way. It's reorienting from intelligence to consciousness and making it explicit that it's a test of the person, not of the intrinsic property of the machine. So this idea of the Garland test is now, it's used in philosophy. So I think that's a beautiful story of how, science and art and philosophy can contribute to each other. 2 other, I think, books. I'll give you books. One is maybe surprising, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I always... Classic, and written when she was 19 years old. I mean, and just amazing in many, many ways. And I had the occasion to reread it a couple of years ago for a radio thing in the UK. And I'd remembered Frankenstein as being this cautionary tale about the hubris of creating life, giving life to something. The bolt of lightning comes down and the creature is alive. But then rereading it, it became clear, and maybe this is true of all great literature, that it's relevant in different ways in different times, that the real Promethean sin of Frankenstein was not endowing the creature with life, but endowing it with consciousness. That it was the ability of Frankenstein's creature, which was always called creature, by the way, never monster, the ability of Frankenstein's creature to feel ostracism, rejection, misery. That's what led to all the carnage. It wasn't the fact that it was alive. That's kind of by the by. So that's one, I think, a wonderful book.
Okay.
People call it the first science fiction novel, and I think that might be right. And the second one is also a science fiction novel by Kazuo Ishiguro called Clara and the Sun. And this came out a few years ago now. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary investigations of this deeply philosophical topic of whether machines can be conscious. It's written from the perspective of a conscious robot. And it explores the human motivations and consequences of this design, of a world that has indeed realized this objective of building conscious machines. And like all of Ishiguro's novels, there's this beautiful combination of the seemingly everyday with these very, very dark undercurrents that gradually surface as the novel goes on. I think both of these books, and Clara and the Sun in particular, exemplify, I think, how literature can complement a kind of more analytical, scientific, philosophical mindset in really putting us in touch intuitively with what we're talking about, what the consequences might be, what we might be overlooking. So strong recommendations.
Thank you very much. So this podcast is about asking the big questions. And the question we were asking in the beginning was, do I really exist? And it's always yes or no questions. So, do I really exist?
No. But.
Okay, but.
It depends on what you mean by exist, really, and I.
Well, we learned about a lot about these terms. So what does no mean? Define the no.
I think I say no by interpreting the question of do I really exist in the sense of existing and I being an essence, like a substance.
Right.
Maybe what the concept of the soul was first sort of conceived for. A table really exists in the sense that there's something there. There's a collection of atoms which exist in a mind-independent way, which we describe as a table. Mm-hmm. And if we're looking for this essence of I, this substance of you somewhere inside your head or wherever it might be, I don't think we'll find it. And this means that when your body dies, I think there is no part of you that is no part of your self-experience that carries on. You carry on in what you've done and the conversations you've had in other people's minds. But there is no essence of you that exists. But that's not to say that there's nothing. The experience of being a self is real, right? It's as real as your experience of color. So does color really exist? Well, not out there in the world independently of a mind.
It's just an impression of my brain, right?
Your brain is making sense of how surfaces reflect light. Different people, different animals will experience different things. And there is something real. There is a surface, there is light being reflected. There are senses, so there's something real.
What is it like to be a bat?
What is it like to be a bat? Then only a bat will know that. This, by the way, this is a foundational paper in the philosophy of consciousness, and it's 50 years old now.
Yeah, I know.
As of this year.
Yeah. This year? Okay.
This year, yeah. I was writing the afterword for the Italian translation of it, which was interesting, which also has one of my favorite Italian. Do you know what the Italian for bat is?
No.
It's pipistrello. It's a really stunningly beautiful word.
Learned something
bat.
Today.
Thomas Nagel, who wrote this paper in 1974, I think is often misread, thinking about this in two ways. Firstly, it's where the standard definition of consciousness, or one of the standard definitions, come from. It's the one I use as well, where he says for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. But his purpose was not to propose that definition. The second way it's often misread is as suggesting that there's this insolvable problem of other minds, that we will never know what it is like to be a bat. That's right, only a bat can know that, although we can understand some things about it. But that wasn't really his point either. He was trying to really question whether a science of consciousness is even possible. Whether we can go from something that travels from subjectivity to objectivity. If we think about science in general, that's the direction of travel. We go from individual points of view to some sort of phenomenon that is independent of how we look at it most of the time. But consciousness is inherently subjective. It's all about a point of view, in a sense. So he was really, digging into that. And that's when I was rereading this paper recently. It was interesting to reflect on where we are with respect to that issue. And I think it is possible. I think there are ways where we can take a scientific perspective on something that is inherently subjective. It's not easy, but it is. I think it's possible. I think you can get data about first-person experiences and propose explanations for that kind of data. So I think you can be in the game of science.
All that said, do I really exist?
No, but.
Thank you.
Nur eine Frage ist ein Podcast der ZEIT. produziert von Pool Artists.